Hello, everyone. We're waiting for people to join, then we'll get started. I think many of you are getting in. If you just give me another minute or two, we'll get started. You should all be in here in the Zoom. We're going to visit with author Yaroslav Trofimov. Am I saying it right, Yaroslav?
Yaroslav Trofimov, yes.
Very good. And he's presenting his award-winning book, Our Enemies Will Vanquish, The Russian Invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence.
The enemies will vanish, not vanquish.
Oh, I'd be happy if you'd vanquish too. I think we can get started. Would you like to say anything? Or, I didn't do much of an introduction. I have all sorts of questions, but maybe you want to give us a quick overview of your book?
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you all for tuning into this. So this book is really a book about the first year of the war in Ukraine, the full-scale war in Ukraine, because obviously the war began 10 years ago with the initial Russian invasion. But the time frame of this one starts on February 23rd, 2022, with me going to see the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and him telling me, in a whisper as he leans towards me, tomorrow at 4 a.m. the war will start. And kind of the bookend to this is a year later. So much had happened. Ukraine survived despite all the expectations. Kyiv didn't fall in 3 days, as many in Moscow or in Washington, for that matter, thought would happen. Ukraine had repelled. Russian forces had regained about half of the initially occupied territory. And sort of the bookend to this is the President Volodymyr Zelensky, having a 1-year anniversary press conference and saying that we realized one thing in this war, as cruel as it may be, nobody likes losers, and so we have to be winners. And obviously, a lot has happened since then. What hasn't changed in that year, we just marked the beginning of the third year of the war. What hasn't changed since then is the front line. The front line in Ukraine has remained more or less static. Here and there, 2 towns changed hands, but more or less it's still the same. So we have now, after the big movements occurred in the first year, we have now a war of attrition underway, in which the fortunes swing first towards the Ukrainians, now towards the Russians. But so far, the nature of the conflict hasn't really changed. And in this book, it's written as as one reviewer put it, a mixture of war correspondence and a road trip, because I tried to go everywhere I could in the front lines. Usually with Manu Bravo, a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer from Spain, who was my companion throughout this war and whose photographs are in the book, and with one of the security advisors that we worked with at the Wall Street Journal, all of them British Army veterans. And I am a war correspondent. I've covered wars since pretty much full time since 9/11, since 2001. I spent 5 years in Kabul, in Afghanistan, running the Wall Street Journal's Afghanistan and Pakistan coverage. And I drove up to Baghdad from Kuwait, across the desert in 2003, and spent a couple of years there, and then came back to Iraq in 2015, during the campaign against Islamic State, and spent quite a bit of time there in Mosul and elsewhere, and various odd wars in between, Somalia, Liberia, and last but not least, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, which really gave us the foretaste of things to come in Ukraine. And I was born in Ukraine. I left Ukraine a long time ago when I was still in the Soviet Union, But I'm very much attached to the city of Kyiv, where I grew up as a child, and would have some of my formative experiences. And this war was different for me because it's a war that it was very painful to watch, because all these places that you have such memories of, all this geography, topography of a city, where every street corner brings back the moments of your youth, suddenly was empty, suddenly was under Russian fire and vulnerable to be annihilated and taken over. And so I think because of that background, I probably took more risks covering this war than other wars, because I felt like I had to push and go and see things. And because I speak the languages and because I know the place and the culture, I felt that I could probably do a better job in explaining all the nuances of the war, and of the challenges and suffering and the heroism and sometimes the cowardice of the people in Ukraine. And so in that way, it was different for me from all the other wars I've covered. But I think the other thing was that this war probably has the moral clarity that we haven't seen in any other conflict since World War II, really. It was a case of very unprovoked Russian invasion of a country that hadn't done anything to threaten Russia. The Ukrainians have done nothing to warrant this. And, in the most brutal fashion, Russia was, annihilating and flattening Ukrainian cities, killing tens of thousands of people. And it's still doing this very day. So that's my short introduction to the book. And please go ahead with the questions.
I have many questions.
Go right away.
It's fair to say that the Ukraine has been a Western-oriented population for quite a while, isn't it?
Well, so Ukraine is an interesting story of change. Ukraine, the traditional view of Ukraine is that, well, it's split halfway. Half is Ukrainian speaking, half is Russian speaking, and half looks west, half looks east, which kind of was the case 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And if we look at the elections in Ukraine, there was always center in the west voting one way, and the south and the east voting another, and it almost came down to 51% versus 49. And even in 2013 and 14, Russia was still seen as a not as an enemy. It was seen as a country that is wealthier, that has probably better jobs, better salaries. And President Zelensky at the time was not a president; he was a showman on television, and he was working and living in Russia. On January 1st, 2014, as the Maidan Revolution was already underway, he hosted the New Year's morning show on Russian state television. And then Russia invaded in 2014, took over Crimea, fomented a very bloody war in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. We tend to not remember that, but 14,000 people died at the time, and the world kind of watched and shrugged. And then there was this 8 years of almost like a scientific experiment. Ukrainians were watching what happens in this Russian world under Russian rule in Donbass, and nothing good happened there. Jobs disappeared, gangsters took over properties, summary executions, no prospects of any better life, and the people of Donbass voted with their feet. And the majority of the population in Russian-controlled areas fled to Ukraine, to Russia, to Europe. And so by the time Putin invaded again in February 2022, every Ukrainian knew someone who had fled from Donbass, and they knew what it means to be under Russian rule. And so I think that really inoculated people in Ukraine from these Russian sympathies. And at the same time, what has been happening is that in the 8 years between the first and the second wars, if you will, Ukraine really switched towards the West. So especially the European Union, there's no way you can sort of underestimate one very critical development. The European Union abolished visas for Ukrainians. So all of a sudden, every Ukrainian could just hop on a plane, pay $29 for a budget airline ticket, and go to Europe, Paris, London, Vienna, and the entire generation grew up at that time with a very different idea of where to go on vacations, where to look for jobs, where to go to study. And I think as time went by, Ukraine became more and more pro-Western, which I think forced Putin to think that time is working against him and prompted him to invade what he did.
Do you think that the destabilization of the eastern Ukraine by pro-Russians should have been sort of nipped in the bud earlier, or do you think that we could have prevented this conflict?
Well, so what happened in 2014 was that Putin tried to destabilize not just Donbass. I mean, Russia was using its assets to foment similar uprisings, if you will, or putsches in Odessa, in Kharkiv, in Zaporizhia, throughout, in pretty much half of Ukraine, all of southern eastern Ukraine. And they failed everywhere except Donetsk and Luhansk. Because the population in all the other cities refused and the elites refused to play by Putin's rules. And Ukraine did try to use force in 2014 to regain these areas. At the time, Ukraine didn't have much of an army. There was one combat-ready brigade in 2014. Because let's remember, before the revolution in 2014, the Ukrainian army was run by a Russian citizen, was the Ministry of Defense, and the government was very much in Russia's pocket. So everything was dismantled, stolen. And that one brigade didn't even have batteries for the fighting vehicles. Private businessmen had to purchase them. And so volunteer units sprang up at the time to try to help, to try to fight the Russians. But the more Ukraine was regaining land, the more direct became Russia's involvement. And at the time, the Ukrainian army was no match for professional Russian troops. And so on the verge of losing in 2015, Ukraine did sign the so-called Minsk agreements that froze the conflict for a time.
So Zelensky has recently replaced his head general. Forgive me, but my Ukrainian is not very good, so I'm not sure that I could pronounce either of those names.
Sure.
But do you have faith? Do the Ukrainian people have faith in this new general?
Well, the previous commander of Ukrainian forces, General Zaluzhny, was and remains very popular among Ukrainians, especially among the troops. Having said that, everyone recognizes the President Zelensky as the democratically elected president of Ukraine has full constitutional authority to replace the commander of the military. That has happened, in other countries. I mean, President Obama replaced his commander in Afghanistan twice. Sure. And so General Syrskyi, the new commander of the military of the Ukrainian armed forces, is not necessarily as popular, but I think it's not a one-man show. Since May 2022, the war is being run by a joint command, something called Stavka, in which Zelensky was sitting, so was Zaluzhny, so was the Ministry of Defense, the Foreign Minister, the heads of the intelligence services. So all the main decisions at the pivotal points of the war were, they were made jointly, not by one man or one woman.
So there's a great deal of war fatigue, for lack of a better word, when it comes to the Ukraine, at least in the United States, that I can determine.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Zelensky, I have read, compares himself in some ways to Abraham Lincoln, who also had to deal with war fatigue. Do the Ukrainian people or Mr. Zelensky or this council have any great ideas about how to get beyond this fatigue?
Right. I mean, if you ask ordinary Ukrainians about war fatigue in Europe or America, they get quite annoyed because what are you fatigued of? We are the ones getting, bombed and killed every day. And, people in Europe have a certain, point because Europe has had to pay a tremendous economic price for weaning itself off Russian energy, Russian gas that fueled the European economy. And yet in Europe, we don't see this Ukraine fatigue at all. Quite the opposite, The European Parliament the European Union just passed a $54 billion bill to aid Ukraine's economy, and Germany and France and the UK are ramping up military aid. So wouldn't see anything like the debate we're having now in the United States, where Russia didn't really have any economic leverage, and the U.S. is not really paying any economic price from what is happening to the Russian economy. We know that the supplemental bill in Congress has been stuck for several months now. It's stuck in the House. It passed the Senate by 70 to 29, but in the House it's stuck because Speaker Johnson has not put it to a vote, and it will probably get a majority vote for there. But I think the issue is that what happens in Ukraine doesn't really affect what happens in Ukraine. I think it affects the global balance of power. Obviously, China is watching what's happening there, and whether Russia can get away, and whether America just walks away from Ukraine. And as China is watching, it's making some calculations about Taiwan. We now have this axis of rogue states, China on one hand, but also Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that have a basically formal military alliance. Russia relies very heavily on North Korean and Iranian munitions, and is sending them technology in exchange. And obviously, a Russian triumph in Ukraine would also, have direct consequences in other areas that the U.S. really cares about, such as East Asia and the Middle East. So that's kind of my answer to the fatigue. And as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, it's not like I have any other option. Russia says openly that Kyiv is a Russian city, Odessa is a Russian city. The Russian former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the leader of Putin's party, has just said that any Ukrainian state, no matter how friendly to Russia, is unacceptable to Russia. Ukrainians have a choice of becoming Russians or die. And so, it's not like there's a peace deal on the table Ukraine can sign up to. So fatigue or no fatigue, if the choice is annihilation or resistance, the Ukrainians will keep resisting, and, if they are deprived of American weapons, that means they will die. A lot more of them will die as they resist. And it's really galling, I think, to Ukrainians to hear this discourse in support of cutting off aid, disguised as sort of fake concern. Oh, well, so many people are dying in Ukraine, so let's, stop aid, so peace will come. No, peace will not come. If American aid stops, just more Ukrainians will die, and Russia will advance faster. But there will be no peace because Russia wants all of Ukraine.
Let's talk a little bit about Russia. I have a question already from Brad. He wants to know, do you know about the estimate casualties of Russians have experienced in the last 2 years?
Well, it's not an exact science, and in wars, it's really hard to know your opponent's casualties. It's all estimates. It's certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Let's just talk about one recent battle. This town of Avdiivka. It's a town that had 30,000 people before the war. It's the first town that Russia captured since May last year. It fell a couple of weeks ago. And was a Russian military official and a blogger who published the information. And so, according to him, Russia lost 16,000 soldiers and something like 400, tanks and armored vehicles to take this town. Just one little town. So just imagine the scale of death and destruction experienced by the Russian military. If you take into account the entire war. So people talk about 300,000. That seems to be like a reasonable number.
It is my understanding that in Russia there's a election coming on March 5th to apparently vote Putin back in. Do you think the events with Alexei Navalny and the dissatisfaction of the Russian people will have an effect on that election or anything in the future as far as Russian attitudes toward the Ukraine?
I don't think so. I think the Russian elections are meaningless. Obviously, Navalny was not allowed to contest this election or a previous election. it's much of an election as elections in North Korea at this point. And as for the attitudes, we have seen that a lot of people died in Russia, and the Russian electorate and the Russian people don't seem to care very much so far. We haven't seen any protests of significance. Certainly haven't seen anything that threatened Putin's regime.
And then there's another election coming in November here in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of how that election turns out, if people in the United States House of Representatives and specifically the Republican Party successfully end further aid to the Ukraine, how do you think that will affect the United States standing with the European allies?
Well, for now, let's look at the reality. I mean, aid has already stopped. I mean, there is no aid coming to Ukraine right now. The last congressional appropriation was at the end of 2022. It's been more than 4 months, and the House of Representatives has not acted on the administration's request. So Ukraine already doesn't have ammunition. That's why it lost Avdiivka. Now, if you look forward, I think it's not just the European allies. Obviously, the European allies are scared, and it's not just because of the not aid for Ukraine, also because former President Trump has said that he may not defend NATO allies. He actually said he would encourage Russia to invade the ones who don't pay enough. And so I think that there is a realization in Europe now that they may be on their own, and they better get their act together in bolstering their defenses, and they may not have enough time. But I think it's not just in Europe. I think the Asian allies, people in Taiwan, are watching very carefully what's happening in Ukraine. Because in Ukraine there are no Americans fighting. There are no Americans dying. The U.S. is just providing equipment and weapons. In case of Taiwan being invaded by China, President Biden has said that the U.S. would intervene directly. And so, if you're sitting in Taiwan and you're watching the U.S. just walking away from Ukraine when the war in Ukraine has caused no casualties among Americans and certainly no destruction of American planes or ships, how can you be confident the U.S. will help Taiwan, where it will certainly mean a direct confrontation with China, with significant losses for U.S. aircrafts and naval assets and personnel?
It's my understanding that the current administration here in Washington is trying to come up with some backroom ways to facilitate aid independent of Congress. At least that's the morning news. I understand that there are 6.5 million, give or take a few, Ukrainians that are now outside of the Ukraine throughout Europe and the United States and the world. Do you think that they are trying to leverage everything they have and send it home to the war effort? How can you speak as a Ukrainian outside of the Ukraine? What do you have to say about them?
Yeah. So, I'm a Ukrainian, but I don't have a Ukrainian passport, so I'm in a slightly different position because I left before Ukraine became independent. But as far as Ukrainian citizens are concerned, only women, children, and men over 60 are allowed to leave the country. So most of these millions of Ukrainians who are abroad, mostly in the European Union, are, they have their family back in Ukraine. They have their, their spouses, parents, siblings fighting on the front lines. And so, of course, they are fundraising. And of course, they are, buying drones and buying, body armor, walkie-talkies, laptops, all kinds of things that help the war effort. And started sending money back. I think as far as the administration is concerned, President Biden has met, the congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle, and we'll see what Speaker Johnson does when Congress comes back from recess. But certainly there are ways in which the administration could also do things up to a point. but nothing can replace. Nothing can replace the investment in American manufacturing of ammunition. That seems to be the biggest bottleneck, because the U.S. capacity to make shells is very limited, and it needs to grow because the entire idea of how wars are fought has changed because of the war in Ukraine, and those investments are impossible without congressional appropriation.
Recently, because of Navalny's death, I believe, the United States imposed more sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. Do you think that those sanctions will have any impact on Russia or the war effort?
I mean, the sanctions, they all have some effect. The war will be not won by sanctions alone, and it's also down to enforcement. We do see that in all the cruise missiles and drones that are shot down over Ukraine, they are filled with American and European components. So somehow those chips and circuits and other stuff do get to Russia, and it's a it's an issue of enforcement, and they get to Russia because a lot of them get routed to Central Asia, to Turkey, to Georgia, to other countries, and then get reshipped to Russia. There are still lots of things that could be done, obviously, to curb the Russian economy, which has proved to be resilient to sanctions up to a point. But again, we're in 2 years into this. The sanctions, some of them start taking effect, over time, of a much longer time frame.
Related here, Brad wants to know what you can say about U.S. military manufacturing capacities and where it needs to be given the current threats.
Well, it's evident from the war in Ukraine, which is a long war on a scale not seen for a very long time, that all the assumptions in the U.S. military planning were wrong. The U.S. has fought wars of insurgency, counterinsurgency against very different opponents with a much, much smaller expenditure of ammunition. And, Ukraine consumes in a couple of days what America can make in terms of ammunition, artillery ammunition, in a month. And the stockpiles are going down. And so there is a dire need to increase the production of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. Stringers, anti-aircraft missiles, not even made anymore. They're certainly very useful. Patriot interceptors, javelins, the anti-tank missiles. Like all that stuff is consumed at a rate that is much higher than what the U.S. industries are capable of manufacturing. And we have seen the European industrial capacity grow much faster than the American one. So the Germans seem to be more successful in wrapping up the industries.
I'm sure that they've probably discussed this. However, President Roosevelt got very creative with his Lend-Lease programs during World War II. Do you know that there's any similar plans currently afoot in today's situation?
So there was actually a Lend-Lease agreement in the beginning of the war, and there was Lend-Lease was part of the congressional approvals back in 2022, but that authority has expired. It has not been renewed by Congress.
And what about Latvia and Lithuania? I understand they feel very threatened by all of this. And are these countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, I hope that they're doing everything they can to support Ukraine?
Well, they are doing everything they can to support Ukraine, and they are, justifiably concerned. So is Finland, so is the Czech Republic, so is Romania, and so is the rest of Scandinavia, and I think increasingly so are France and Germany. Poland is the leader in Europe in terms of the military buildup. They're spending a much higher portion of their GDP on the defense than any other country, any other large country in Europe. And and they're purchasing with gear from the U.S., South Korea, and elsewhere. because they know that if Ukraine falls, they could be next. The Baltic countries, they know they cannot defend themselves by themselves. And so I think what they're doing is they're shipping as much as they can to Ukraine, because they know that if Ukraine doesn't fall, then they will be spared as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a realization across Europe that a full-scale war in the European Union could erupt in a matter of a few years if Russia is successful in Ukraine.
I've read, and I could be wrong, you would certainly know, that about 27% of the Ukrainian territory has now been formally annexed by
18.
Russia.
18.
Oh,
18% is currently controlled by Russia.
um, and you've lost how many million people?
Well, it's hard to say because a lot of the people in occupied areas have fled those areas, but millions.
Millions. And essentially, it's my guess that the United States is being justifiably accused of being isolationist. Um, how do you teach someone or a country or an ally that isolationism is a failed policy?
Well, the U.S. has a luxury of having oceans on both of its sides, and so the threat is not necessarily seen as such a direct threat as people in Europe experience. But we have seen history, in both world wars, isolationism had to end, in the Second World War because of an attack by Japan that broke the illusion of America being immune to all these faraway conflicts. The U.S. economy depends on a special role that the U.S. plays in the world, including the fact that the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and allowing a very different axis of authoritarian powers to write the rules by which the world lives would have, a much bigger effect on America's well-being than any spending Ukraine requires right now.
Let's take a minute and step back and talk to me about religion. How is the Russian Orthodox Church positioned in Ukraine to deal with this conflict?
Well, the Russian Orthodox Church is in Russia. All
I
right,
know.
so it is a state religion. It is very closely connected with the government. It has blessed the armed forces and told them to go and fight, the infidels in Ukraine, and it's really part of Putin's apparatus. You know, Ukraine does not have a single church. Ukraine it's a pluralistic society. We have a Jewish president, a Muslim minister of defense right now, and it has Catholics, it has Orthodox of various denominations, it has Protestants. And so, the religion and the state are truly separate in Ukraine.
Someone asks me about your opinion of Trump and President Biden's positions, attitudes, and behaviors toward the Ukrainian and Russian conflict. Can you summarize?
Well, President Biden has said repeatedly, we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. There's criticism in Ukraine that the Biden administration self-restrained itself and was, when it did send the aid, it was too late and sometimes too little. But there is overall a huge gratitude for America and the Biden administration leading the way, especially in the early month of the war. Former President Trump has said he will bring peace to Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't explained how. Ukraine would love to have peace in 24 hours.
Someone asked me if it's true that the Allies are working to unfreeze Russian dollars and send the money to the Ukraine. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, so there's about $300 billion in Russian assets sitting in NATO countries. A great deal of them in Belgium, which has the clearinghouse for these assets. So there are discussions about this. There's no decisions, and before the actual assets could could be used to pay for Ukraine, the first step would be to seize the interest. There are billions and billions of dollars in interest on these accounts that have accumulated in the last couple of years. And so, the immediate discussions are about this first step of seizing the proceeds from the assets first.
There have been a couple of news pieces here in the States about the Ukrainian children being abducted by Russia. Um, what can you tell us about that?
Well, the International Criminal Court has indicted President Putin and the head of the Russian, Children's Rights Office for the crime of abducting Ukrainian children. Thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children were taken, especially from orphanages, but also from families, were taken to Russia, brainwashed, giving Russian passports, indoctrinated, and taught they are Russians. It's very similar to what the Nazis were doing in places like Poland in World War II, actually. And there is an effort by the Ukrainian government, international organizations, the families to try to trace these families, and when legitimate parents or guardians are found, sometimes the children are returned, but it's a very difficult process.
Brad wants to know, how is Putin's rattling of the nuclear saber restricted and/or allowed by China?
Well, I think China obviously doesn't want to see nuclear war, and China, as well as India, have been cautioning Putin. I don't know to what extent he listens to them, but I think what's really interesting is how this nuclear saber rattling has restrained the U.S. Because when the war began, Putin made a speech on television and said, any attempt to interfere in my special military operation, quote unquote, will be met with the kind of response you have never seen in your lifetimes. And over and over again, that threat throttled American and European support, all kinds of capabilities that we're giving years later, or a month later, or a year later. We're not giving initially because of the fear of what would the Russians do if we give them tanks, what would the Russians do if we give them cruise missiles, and are still throttling things. The U.S. has been deliberating for almost a year now whether to provide the ATACMS long-range missiles to Ukraine. Still haven't been provided because of the fear.
A noted expert in the area said that the Ukraine has weeks and months worth of resistance left if they receive no more military aid. Do you think it's that short, or do you think that that the Ukraine can exist for another year or two?
Well, I think Ukraine can exist forever. Let's look at this. I mean, U.S. aid is important, but U.S. aid is only half of the aid that Ukraine receives. That half comes from Europe. That hasn't stopped. That's growing. Ukraine continues to receive artillery ammunition, our defense assets, and all the other stuff from Germany, from France, from the United Kingdom, from Finland. So, Russia has not been able to break through Ukrainian lines and have a rapid advance. They fought several months for one town. They lost 16,000 soldiers. They finally got it, and now they're fighting for the villages right next to it. So, I definitely disagree that Ukraine has weeks a month left. But what will happen if the USS is not coming through is that Ukraine will have a lot more casualties. A lot more Ukrainian civilians will die because Ukraine is running out of air defense missiles. So today, in the city of Odessa, Russia fired a missile or a drone at a residential building, killed 7 people, including children. And obviously more Ukrainian soldiers will die.
Someone wants to know, if Putin was assassinated, who would be next in line in Russia, and how do they feel about the Ukraine?
I think it's hard to say who's next in line if he's assassinated, but what I can say is that, and that's an opinion held, I think, by the Ukrainian leadership, but also by pretty much everybody in the Russian opposition, is that no matter who comes after Putin will be better than Putin for one reason. I mean, that person can be an extreme nationalist and a horrible person and all that, but that person will not own this war. That person could say mistakes were made and walk away from it. in the way that Putin cannot, because Putin's fate is linked to the continuation of the war. Stopping the war for him is much riskier than pressing ahead.
How can the average citizen weaken Putin's power?
Citizen of Russia?
Citizen of the world.
Well, I think, citizens of Ukraine obviously are fighting, the Russian military. I think the best way to weaken Putin's power is to ensure a strong Ukrainian military that beats back the Russian forces. A military defeat in Ukraine, a proper military defeat in Ukraine, will probably end Putin's rule. It's that's what happens usually in Russian history. They have revolutions as a result of failed wars abroad. Sanctions help. So all the tools that have been employed until now, and we're now in the phase that is the war of attrition, which is not actually in Russia's favor. Because Russia is losing more tanks, more armored personnel carriers, more fighting vehicles, more artillery pieces a day or a month than it can make or refurbish. So in 2-3 years, it will run out at the current trajectory. And unlike Ukraine, it has nowhere else to get them. There's no stock of tanks or artillery that somebody can give to the Russians sitting out there. I can get artillery shells, but not actual tanks. And so as long as Western aid to Ukraine continues, this grinding of Russian forces could lead to a situation where Ukraine will have a breakthrough. But patience is required for that.
Which sort of relates to Evie's question. She said, even if Ukraine wins the war, whatever that means for you, the Ukraine, won't that mean that there will always also be a risk from Russia?
Well, the risk from Russia will be as long as this imperial idea dominates Russian politics. And the Russians have not reconciled themselves with the idea that Ukraine is a separate country. It's not just Putin; it's a widespread notion. Even Navalny, who in his final years, was against the war. Back in 2014, he said, when asked about whether Russia should return Crimea if he becomes president, famously said, "Crimea is not a sandwich; you cannot give it back." And so, a thorough defeat of Russia, if that occurs, would probably lead to great rethinking of what it means to be Russian, and what Russia stands for, and what should be the goals of Russia. Because right now, kind of all of energies of Russia are fueled, sort of funneled into this idea of territorial expansion, which is, if you think of it, bizarre in the extreme, because Russia is already the largest country by surface in the world, with a very small population for that land. Russia will probably be outstripped by Yemen in a few years. It's smaller, has fewer people than Bangladesh, and yet it's fighting this war, losing hundreds of thousands of people to get more empty land. Because everybody flees from the Russian advance. Nobody wants to live under the Russians, and it's wasting lives to take cities that have become fields of rubble.
So I think Joe has a salient question for all Americans. Is the United States government doing enough to promote Ukraine's cause to Americans?
Well, I think it's a good question, and it's looking from the outside, it's really disconcerting how Ukraine has become a pawn in America's own cultural wars and debates that it has nothing to do. But somehow the issue of American border security, which is has long been one of the most divisive issues in America, somehow gets entangled with Ukraine's war to defend itself. I mean, how is this even related? And very often the discussion about Ukraine is now based not on actual facts on the ground, but it is colored by the ideological divisions between the two parties, and Ukraine is a hostage of that.
How did the Ukrainians feel about that?
Well, they're not very happy. Obviously, they would rather have something to defend themselves with. 4 months ago.
What do you think is likely to happen?
Well, I don't know. So Speaker Johnson, who holds the keys right now to this, Speaker of the House, he said in October when he got the job that we will not let the Ukrainians down, and I know that if Putin wins, he will not stop in Ukraine. So he does say he knows, and he will help. So we'll see what happens. I think not all hope is lost for the Ukrainians, but it's also quite plausible that there will be no agreement, and this Congress will not pass anymore for Ukraine.
Are there any wonderful news about potential Ukrainian counteroffensives?
There will be no wonderful counteroffensive this year. Ukraine is on the defensive this year. Russia started to move ahead, and we are back to this very simple, basic math of ammunition. And Ukraine had slight advantage in ammunition last fall. Now it's outgunned 10-1 by the Russians because the American shells never arrived, and because Russia's new ally North Korea sent more than 1 million shells. European production is ramping up, but it won't be enough for this year. Next year, maybe Ukraine will have enough ammo if the Europeans and the Americans get their act together. There's the issue of money, but there's also the issue of actual physical scarcity of ammunition.
It all is very sad. People are dying and peace is not achieved, and people's homes are getting burned and apartment buildings being destroyed. It's all very sad. Are the Ukrainian people walking around in a fog of depression and utter unbelief, or how do the Ukrainian people cope with all of this?
Well, I think the utter unbelief and the depression were there in the beginning. I think it's been 2 years and change, and people are trying to lead normal lives as far as they can. Even in the city of Kharkiv, which gets bombed almost every day, schools have reopened underground in the subway, and people adjust. But I think they know that no matter how big are the casualties now, things would be much worse if Ukraine surrenders and the Russians take over, because the Russian officials have been very explicit about what they will do. They published those blueprints for what to do with Ukraine, and it is physical annihilation of the nationalist elites. So killing hundreds of thousands of writers, intellectuals, government officials, then re-educating the rest. Abolishing the name Ukraine, abolishing the language, and raising Russian children from making the children of everybody else into Russians. And so Ukraine has lived through tragedies in the past, like famine in the 1930s, in which millions died. And so I think people know what it means to be under Russian rule, and the situation is terrible right now, but it's infinitely better than living under Russian occupation.
How do the Russians feel about this war?
Well, I think many Russians support the war. I think the propaganda machine is working, and the Putin regime has successfully sold the narrative to many Russians that we are fighting, against NATO, against the Nazis. We kind of it's a sequel to World War II, like our grandfathers fought the Nazis. Now your children have to die in the fields of Ukraine again. And the ones that don't think so are either silent because, saying anything contrary to the official narration of events is a criminal offense in Russia. There are tens of thousands of people who have been arrested for, quote unquote, spreading fakes about the Russian army, which carries a stiff, prison sentence. And millions of others have fled the country, especially after the mobilization in the fall of 2022. If you go to Dubai, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to sort of combine two questions here.
Mm-hmm.
Brad wants to know what surprised you the most and what in the last 2 years and you never thought you would think of. But Catherine says this war must be heart-wrenching for you to watch happen in your own homeland and to watch from the outside. What is it that your book could tell us that our media is not telling us?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna start with the second question. And I wasn't watching from the outset. I was in Ukraine, all of 2022 and much of last year. and I was just there a couple months ago. So I'm very much not covering it from the outside. It's just the book is it's from the inside. And okay, I mean, I am the media. I work for the Wall Street Journal, so many of these stories were also in the pages of the journal. But obviously, it's in the book, it's a first-person narrative, and it's much more expanded, obviously, and more in depth. As to what surprised me, there's a saying that at war, people's character reveals itself like in a tin can. You only find out what's inside when people are faced with adverse circumstances that they've never experienced before. And I think the Ukrainians surprised themselves. And I think they expected the Ukrainian people to be so resilient, so organized, so determined, so brave and courageous in fighting against a much more powerful enemy, and in winning, actually. And I guess that thing that surprised me, was the power of the images coming from Ukraine had over the American society and European societies. And I met hundreds of people in Ukraine who came from the U.S., who came from England, Ireland, Italy, Canada, after seeing the sort of the footage of destruction and the death in Ukraine, and most of them had never been there before. Most of them had no connections to the place, and they came because they wanted to help, and they risked their lives. And some came as medics, as volunteers. Others came to fight. They joined the Ukrainian army, and to me, it was really surprising how much the Ukrainian tragedy resonated around the world.
Lately, it would seem that Mr. Putin is incarcerating and detaining and killing individuals. I'm not sure why. What do you think of your colleague, your Wall Street Journal colleague, being incarcerated, and who do you think Putin will trade for us to get him back?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not lately. I mean, it's been the trademark Russian policy, for since Putin came to power. Boris Nemtsov, another prominent politician, was also assassinated in Moscow. So there is a long history of poisonings abroad, the Skripals, et cetera, et cetera. As for Evan, well, Evan has been in a Russian jail for nearly a year now. He is jailed for the crime of practicing journalism. He was doing what every good journalist should do, and I think the Russian regime was afraid of the truth that Evan was writing in the Wall Street Journal about, the strains in the Russian society from the war, and about the effect that the war is having on Russia. And I'm not privy to the discussions, so I don't know who and when Putin wants to trade Evan for, but we certainly hope he'll be home as soon as possible because he has done nothing wrong.
We all do. Thank you for 1 hour.
Thank you.
While you have the pulpit, at least listening to a handful or to many Americans, what would you encourage us all to do?
Well, I think don't forget Ukraine, and that's the key message, because it's still there. People are still dying every day, and it still matters just as much as it did 2 years ago.
Thank you. And I would tell you that many people are putting in the comment section their thanks to you and wishing you well and that you take care of yourself.
Thank
We
you.
need more reporters like you. Thank you
you.
for writing this book. I would encourage you all to read the book. It is available at the Learned Owl bookstore. You'll find the links in our chat boxes. And we truly appreciate you taking the time to write the book and to share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good evening, all, or good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.